In the very last video I did on this channel, I talked about how the Trump administration is escalating the war on whistleblowers and the First Amendment that was waged by the Obama administration. The day after I posted that video, the Trump administration escalated even further with an unprecedented move to charge a publisher under the Espionage Act. As I'm sure you heard by now, Julian Assange, a co-founder of WikiLeaks, was charged with 17 counts of the Espionage Act on Friday for publishing the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs obtained by Chelsea Manning. This collection of classified military documents contained evidence of war crimes committed by the US government. The deliberate targeting and murdering of civilians and journalists and first responders on tape. The illegal and unconstitutional international torture network, and Guantanamo Bay, an extrajudicial, unconstitutional prison that was set up by the CIA and the Bush White House. It exposed corruption in the US government as well as a systematic effort to cover up civilian casualties by having a large percentage of the civilian population classified as enemy combatants without any solid evidence, so that when civilians were killed in an airstrike or a raid or a drone strike, the default position would be to classify them as an enemy combatant as an attempt to intentionally keep the civilian casualties in official reports low. That is just a small part of what we learned from the documents obtained by Chelsea Manning and published by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And that came at a time when our government, specifically the executive branch, was lying to everyone about the war. They lied about our reasons for going into the war. And the entire time the war was going on, they were lying about the day-to-day operations and what was happening on the ground, not just to the American public, but to Congress, who's supposed to have oversight and act as a check on the executive branch. So let's be clear here. The publishing of the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs was one of the greatest journalistic undertakings of our lifetime. Not only because it shed light on one of the biggest foreign policy debacles in US history, but because at the time, all of the mainstream media was in unison, just reporting the lies and propaganda coming from the Bush administration when it came to this war, until Julian Assange got his hands on those documents from his source, Chelsea Manning. So now, in retaliation for exposing war crimes and corruption of the US government, the Department of Justice is yet again doing something never before seen in US history to get back at Julian Assange. The first break with precedent was when they had Assange forcibly dragged out of an embassy where he was protected with asylum. Now, they're charging a journalist with 17 counts of the Espionage Act for publishing documents that exposed war crimes of the US government. Because understand something, publishing classified government documents is an essential part of journalism, and it has been ever since secret classifications became a thing. I've talked about this on the show many times before. All the things that our government doesn't want the people to see, the public who's supposed to hold them accountable to see, they will classify it as secret so that you have to go to the government and have a special clearance to see it. And like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and many other whistleblowers exposed, just because it's classified secret doesn't mean the public should not see it. It is literally impossible to do any kind of serious national security journalism when you don't have the protection from being prosecuted for publishing classified documents. Because if you can be prosecuted for publishing classified documents, your only alternative would be to report on the things that are already public because they've been cleared by the government as information that doesn't make them look bad or counter whatever narrative they're trying to put out. And at that point, all you're doing is just reading pre-approved press releases from the government, and that's not journalism. So every journalist in the world is on notice, because if they can charge Julian Assange, who's not a US citizen, who did not even publish this information inside the United States, who's completely outside of the jurisdiction of the United States and the Department of Justice and our laws, if we can charge him with the Espionage Act, there isn't a journalist anywhere in the world we can't charge with it. This also sets a dangerous precedent for other countries, because what's preventing Saudi Arabia or China from enforcing their own draconian domestic laws on journalists who report on them from around the world? What's stopping them from charging and extraditing a reporter from the BBC or reporters here in the United States at the New York Times or the Washington Post if they publish something that is critical of their governments? Because both of these countries have domestic laws where you can be arrested for being critical of the government. Now, the US has set the standard that it's not only okay to prosecute journalists critical of your government, but you can also have them arrested and extradited from anywhere in the world and brought back to your country to face charges. It's almost impossible to overstate how dire and serious the implications of this new precedent is. What's left of the First Amendment in the United States is on the line with this case. Protections for journalists around the world is on the line with this case. Knowing this, the two most progressive senators in the country, who also happen to be running for president, decided to put out some fairly weak sauce, unimpressive statements of condemning these actions from the Trump administration. So let me start with Bernie Sanders. I provided some strong criticism of Bernie after Julian Assange was illegally dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London at the behest of the US government, and Bernie said nothing. It was a full frontal assault on journalism and the First Amendment, as well as an extreme abuse of power by the Justice Department. A Justice Department under a president who Bernie Sanders has repeatedly said is hostile to the First Amendment for petty things like calling Jim Acosta and Chuck Todd names on Twitter. But when they did their biggest attack on journalism, breaking all kinds of precedent and making national and international headlines for days, Bernie didn't have a word to say about it. And at the time, I said he's actively choosing to ignore this topic because there's no way he didn't know about it. But there's no way he's going to be able to do it forever. When he is eventually forced to come out and address this, he better give a strong, forceful defense of Julian Assange similar to Tulsi Gabbard, or this is going to be a real point of concern for progressives, myself included. On Friday afternoon, more than a month after Julian Assange was arrested, and right after these new rounds of indictments came down, Bernie Sanders took to Twitter to deliver a feeble statement on these indictments. Quote, "Let me be clear, it is a disturbing attack on the First Amendment for the Trump administration to decide who is or not a reporter for the purposes of criminal prosecution. Donald Trump must obey the Constitution, which protects the publication of news about our government," end quote. So yes, Bernie is factually right on this tweet. But if you take his words literally, he's objecting to the fact that, quote, "the Trump administration is deciding who is and who isn't a journalist for the purpose of prosecution." So I agree with all the things you said right there, Bernie, but you're leaving out a lot of important information. There's no mention about the fact that this entire prosecution of Julian Assange is in retaliation for him exposing war crimes of the US government. There's no actual defense of Julian Assange in the legendary work he did publishing the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs. Maybe this tweet would get a pass if he sent it out the day Julian Assange was arrested in the Ecuadorian embassy, but that was over a month ago. And from then to now, this tweet is the best response you could muster up. And it's particularly egregious because right now, Bernie Sanders has been in somewhat of a back and forth with some mainstream media figures like Chuck Todd and Bill Kristol and others, where they're making it seem like Bernie Sanders has something to apologize for because he was vociferously against the war in Iraq. And Bernie Sanders has been coming out on top in all of these exchanges and getting a lot of praise from his supporters because he refuses to apologize for being anti-war, especially when it comes to the Iraq war, because it's been an unmitigated disaster. But the thing is, Bernie Sanders and his supporters would not know the details of how big a disaster the Iraq war was if it wasn't for Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. We wouldn't have known about all the things that I listed earlier in this segment. We would not have known about Guantanamo Bay. We would not have known about the torture network set up by the CIA. We would not have known about the intentional underreporting of civilian casualties. We would not have known about we would not have known about the deliberate killing of civilians and first responders and journalists in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's a bitch move from Bernie to accept all the praise for being right about how bad the Iraq war would be, But now that the person who proved you correct before anyone else did is being prosecuted for that very same act, you're gonna hang him out to dry because your advisors are telling you going out and boldly defending Julian Assange might be a little too controversial. You might offend the sensibilities of a couple people in mainstream media and in the establishment and in the national security state. I don't like that. Like I said in that video where I criticized Bernie Sanders over a month ago now, this isn't one of those issues where you get to play the fence and half agree with people like Jake Tapper and Chuck Todd and the mainstream media because they are completely wrong on this issue. I don't get the strategy of saying I'm going to be half correct and say this is an egregious attack on the First Amendment, but I'm also going to be half wrong by not defending Julian Assange. Like, it makes no sense. I'm going to be half correct and I'm also going to be half wrong and I'm just going to make everybody happy. It does not work that way, Bernie. It does not work that way, Bernie. The correct position to take is I'm going to defend Julian Assange. I'm going to defend WikiLeaks. I'm going to defend Chelsea Manning because the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs that they released were some of the most important works in journalism of our lifetime. But like I said, him and his advisors have gotten together and made the decision that they won't take the correct position because it's too controversial and it's not politically convenient to them at this moment. Now, Elizabeth Warren, as you would expect, had an even worse take on the situation. For Elizabeth Warren and her more establishment centrist leanings, defending Julian Assange and the work that he did was just completely out of the question. The best you could have hoped for with Elizabeth Warren would have been a statement similar to Bernie Sanders where she doesn't outright defend him, but she'll say this is an unprecedented attack on the First Amendment. But if you were hoping for that best case scenario, I hate to disappoint because Elizabeth Warren even fell short of making a statement like that. The way I interpreted her statement, she is reaffirming the concerns that I have that she is too susceptible to the bullshit propaganda from the US war machine and the national security state. Which, like I said earlier, if that's true and she's not willing to take on US empire, that is a deal breaker for me. So here's her statement. Quote, Assange is a bad actor who has harmed US national security and he should be held accountable. But Trump should not be using this case as a pretext to wage war on the First Amendment and go after the free press who hold the powerful accountable every day. So to me, it seems her take on the situation is fuck Julian Assange, throw the book at him, but Trump better not use this precedent to go after people who she considers to be respectable, legitimate journalists. And let me, another question that I ask is, Liz, who are you considering respectable, legitimate journalists? The people at CNN who get damn near everything they talk about dead wrong and do the propaganda for the US military who lied us to get into the Iraq war? Or MSNBC, who was owned by General Electric during the lead up to the Iraq war and was knowingly pushing the Bush administration's propaganda so that they can get huge defense contracts. Those are the people you consider real journalists? The people who fired Ashley Banfield for speaking out against the Iraq war and Phil Donahue for speaking out against the Iraq war. Those are the people you consider to be real journalists? Let me know. Let me know. Those are the people that you want to protect from prosecution. In her mind, she does not consider Julian Assange and the legendary work that WikiLeaks has done, not just on the Iraq-Afghanistan war logs, but all of their leaks and publications throughout the years. She still doesn't consider them legitimate journalists. So Liz, just fucking spare me. Just spare me. She's always pandering to the establishment. She's always looking for a round of applause by repeating the bullshit talking points that they have put out endlessly. But I digress from that. Let me focus on that first part of her statement. Quote, Assange is a bad actor who has harmed US national security and he should be held accountable. Liz, what the fuck are you talking about? What are you basing this idea that Julian Assange has harmed national security on? This has been the main line of attack from the CIA and the US military and the White House and the entire national security apparatus and the mainstream media, as well as the military-industrial complex, to smear Julian Assange ever since we exposed all of them. And none of them have ever provided a shred of evidence to back up that claim. The only thing that we know for a fact is what Julian Assange published exposed war crimes and that embarrassed and incriminated the establishment and the national security apparatus. But Elizabeth Warren, like the loyal lapdog she is to the war machine, is going to come out and repeat the bullshit propaganda that has been debunked 8 ways to Sunday without question. If you don't see how that's a problem, I'm starting to think you don't want to see how that's a problem. Because the only purpose that claim has is to, one, smear Julian Assange and to make it seem like what he did is any different from what journalists do every day publishing classified information. And two, to protect the war criminals who got exposed. Furthermore, that suggests to me that if she was in the White House, if she was in Donald Trump's position right now, she would be just fine with the Department of Justice prosecuting Julian Assange. And that is fucking crazy. Good God, that is a red line. So all the so-called progressives who are out here doing apologetics for Elizabeth Warren and her centrist leanings, I would love to hear them explain this one. Explain to me why it's an acceptable position for a so-called progressive to have that, quote, Assange is a bad actor who has harmed U.S. national security and he should be held accountable. Because that's not an acceptable position for a true progressive to have. That is the position of someone who's not willing to stand up to U.S. empire and the military-industrial complex, someone who is willing to cover up or ignore the war crimes and instead go after the people who expose them, which is exactly what the Obama administration did, which is exactly what the Trump administration is doing right now, right this second. She is way too willing to defer to the same war criminals and buffoon jackass generals that got us into this mess to begin with, which means she'll just continue the status quo of U.S. empire if she was in the White House. That is another disqualifying position that you could add on top of her other disqualifying positions, like not backing Medicare for all 100%, pushing bullshit corporate Democrat alternatives to Medicare for all, like Medicare buy-ins, Medicare for America, all these other neoliberal claptrap workarounds to avoid getting healthcare to everybody in the country. Or her willingness to take corporate PAC money in the general election after she has railed all this time about how corporate money corrupts politicians. Once you take corporate money, you do the bidding of politicians. And now she's openly boasting about how she's going to take corporate money in the general election. I said it before, I'll say it again, and I'll say it a million more times throughout this primary. In no objective, rational analysis is Elizabeth Warren the second best progressive candidate in the 2020 Democratic primary. That is a title that has been held and is currently held by Tulsi Gabbard. Full stop. Because these policy positions that Elizabeth Warren has, we wouldn't accept them, and we do not accept them from any other politician. We don't accept them from Barack Obama. We don't accept that from Hillary Clinton. We don't accept that from Joe Biden. But people are carving out a special exception for Elizabeth Warren because she's tough on Wall Street bankers in her committee hearings. Well, I'm telling you from right now, that shit does not fly with me. Chastising executives in your committee hearings, your proposals for tuition-free public college and universal daycare, they're nice. I love that about you. You work on the CFPB, thumbs up, good job with that. But that does not secure a number 2 spot among progressives for me, and it really shouldn't do that for anyone else, especially when there are candidates in the race who support all those same policy positions without stabbing progressives in the back on all of our other important policy priorities, like ending U.S. empires and these endless wars that we're fighting in the Middle East. We're fighting 8 wars in the Middle East. We're fighting a whole other set of shadow wars all over the continent of Africa. Or getting Medicare for all in this country, which we desperately need. 40,000 people die every year in the United States because they can't afford basic health care. That isn't a thing in any other country. So Medicare for all is not up for debate. And getting private money out of politics, which is the root of all of these problems, because these corporations can donate to politicians, buy influence, and get favorable policies when these politicians get into power. So Julian Assange is now facing 170 years if he's convicted here in the United States. Bernie Sanders has proven that he's not willing to stick his neck out on this one and go to the mat to defend Julian Assange and the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs. Elizabeth Warren is completely off the reservation and planted her flag in West Bubblefuck and sounds like she's in favor of prosecuting Julian Assange since she's repeating establishment propaganda that he's put U.S. national security in danger and making no mention of his contributions to journalism and how he's exposed the war crimes of the U.S. government and many of the governments around the world. The only presidential candidate to come out and give an unapologetic defense of Julian Assange and the work that he's done is Tulsi Gabbard, and we should all keep that in mind.